Imagine being 21 years old and being a member of one of the most notorious bands in the world, writing or co-writing 10 out of the 12 songs that were recorded for one of the most shockingly brilliant records of all time, and then spending the next 44 years explaining what it was like to suddenly be replaced by Sid Vicious because allegedly you liked the Beatles. Of course, the story has changed a million times over the years, but the truth is that the story of Glen Matlock, the original bass player for the Sex Pistols, is a little bit more complicated than that. How complicated? Well, you're about to find out as I talk to Glen Matlock of the Sex Pistols on Baxy's Musical Podcast.
It's Baxy's Musical Podcast.
So let's just say this. As a band, the Sex Pistols were an absolute mess. They were great, but they were a mess. Part of that seemed to be by design. Some of it seemed to be provoked by the band's manager, Malcolm McLaren, from creating the fallout from a disastrous BBC interview with Bill Grundy, to the releasing of God Save the Queen, to the release of their first album, Nevermind the Bollocks, to signing 3 different record contracts with 3 different record companies, all within the same year, from the cancellation of dozens of live shows. The reputation of the Sex Pistols was a combination of calculated genius and a fabricated disaster. But Glen Matlock has been very busy over the last 44 years, working with Iggy Pop, The Damned, The Faces, Midge Ure. He even had a short-lived band with Sid Vicious, the very guy who replaced him in the Sex Pistols. Glen Matlock has a brand new solo record coming out this year, and this is my conversation with Glen Matlock of the Sex Pistols on Baxy's Musical Podcast. So let me just start off. I know going back a few months, you were in Massachusetts. I believe you were to be doing a couple of shows with the Dropkick Murphys back in March.
I was supposed to be doing them. I got invited by them to do it, but because of what happened, that show got cancelled. And I was then going to go on and do some more solo shows, but I had to pull all of that because of what went down. So I never came in the end.
So were you still in London at the time that all happened?
Yeah, I was on the cusp of flying out.
Really? So at the time that they made that decision and you're going to stay home, what was going on in England at the time? I mean, you know, we here in the States know what's going on here, but you guys had been experiencing it sooner than we had. Tell us what things are like now.
Well, now we're supposed to be coming out of lockdown. How wise that is, I don't know. I don't think it's particularly wise. Things have started to open up. And I was in the West End, which is like kind of downtown. I had to take a friend to Harley Street. It's a bit infirm and can't use public transport, so I did that. And I noticed that there's a lot more shops open, but, you know, people have to queue to get in. Only let a few people at a time. They're being quite careful. But back when I was supposed to be coming over, I just finished a tour of the UK with Earl Slick, who plays with me. And we went round the UK. And we kept hearing news about things that were going on, and then it got a bit funny towards the end. I was up in Scotland, you know, and people want you to go and sign things and shake hands at the merch table, and I was getting cagey about doing it, you know, because you don't know where people have been, they don't know where you've been, and once people have had a drink, they get a little bit stroppy, like, oh, you won't shake hands with me. I'm going, well, where's the news, you know? So I was kind of hip to what was going on, and also I've got friends in Italy who sort of preceded the whole thing, and I've been speaking to them, and I thought, well, this is going to get worse. So the Boston show with the Dropkick Murphys, they cancelled it, or the promoters cancelled it. I was going to still try and come on and do the rest of the shows, because not only was I doing shows, I've made a new album, which was going to be mixed in New York by a guy called Mario McNulty, who did my last album. The idea was I was going to do my shows, hang out in New York, and sit with them on the mixes. I couldn't do that, and I was also being offered more shows, and I was just going to stay in the States. I've got a work permit till the end of the year, and now I've got a work permit that I paid for that I'm not using. So, you know, it hasn't been great, and I lost a lot of money, but I decided not to come. to America and Canada after the Dropkick Murphys thing.
So
I didn't want to be self-isolated
right.
in a cheap motel in the arse end, like in Allentown or somewhere like that,
So the new album is it on hold at this point, or is it still where it was when this whole thing went down?
No, it's been mixed, but it needs tweaking. But the thing is, do I want to put an album out in the fall and then not be able to go on tour and promote it? Not much point,
Yeah.
That's what the decisions that all musicians are facing at the moment.
I've listened to the last solo record you did in 2018, Good to Go. I thought it was a great record. I thought it was a good, solid rock and roll record. And you're the new one with Earl Slick and Slim Jim Phantom. You have been playing with those guys for actually a couple of years, right?
Yeah, I have now. We've been friends for a long time. And El got stuck here. I just drove him to Heathrow this morning. He's been here for like 3 months since we did the last tour. And we've been doing some online shows, just me and him. He was like my lockdown buddy. Slim Jim played on the Good to Go album. He's not on the new one because when I was thinking about making it, he was pretty busy with his own thing and the Stray Cats.
Right.
And so I kind of moved on a little bit. But so that was more rockabilly because Slim Jim was involved in it. It's not for rockabilly, the new one. In fact, it's a bit more soul-y than anything else. In fact, there's some few surprises. We've even done a cover. I like doing a wacky cover on the last album. I didn't want the guitar, Scott Walker. But on the new one, we've done a cover of Constant Craving by K.D. Lang. It sounds like the Rolling Stones doing Harlem Shuffle's version of it.
Oh, very cool.
So,
very cool.
There you go.
So it's you're looking to release it out in the fall, right?
Well, I was. What's going to happen now, I don't know. It might still come out in the fall, I don't know. If we can't go on tour, there's not much point putting the record out. That's the equation we're all dealing with.
So I want to go back a little bit because
Here we go.
Yeah, of course. Here we go. I mean, I'm sure you've answered all the questions about the Sex Pistols that you can possibly handle.
I'm sure I have. I wish I had a little sort of zapper in my hand or in my watch, that plays the Twilight Zone theme tune. As soon as anybody says, "Let's go back," and I can press that.
We'll get to some of that, but one of the things that has always been kind of curious to me is a guy who's had the experience that you have had, and you left that band 44 years ago. At some point, do you now just accept it that people are just going to start talking about the Sex Pistols, or have you kind of feel like? I mean, I know you've moved on in a lot of ways. You've released a lot of records. You've worked with a lot of other people, but have you reached that point where you either embrace it or just say, "Oh, Jesus, enough of that"?
No, I embraced that a long while ago. It used to get me. I think there's two things, but the kind of like sort of watershed moments. One, I wrote a book about it called "I Was a Teenage Sex Pistol," which is in its 5th edition. It's still available on Amazon.
Yep.
And it's a good read. But I thought by writing the book, I'd never have to talk about it again. But of course, when you write a book, you've got to go and promote it. And what you've got to do more than anything else is talk about it all again. So I thought, okay, didn't think that one through. And then also, I read some interview with Keith Richards. It's quite an old interview, and I read it a while back. And the guy asked him all these questions about the Stones and all that. And at the end of it, he says, "One more question, Keith, silly question here. How much is a pint of milk?" Right? And Keith Richards said, "Hey, man, don't ask me. I've been a rock star all my life." Well, I don't think I've been a rock star all my life, but I've been an ex-Sex Pistol all my life. And I don't know any different, so it's par for the course. I don't get up in the morning thinking about the Sex Pistols, but nearly every other day I do an interview with somebody like you who asks me about it. So There you go.
So when you were a kid, and this is obviously before the Sex Pistols, what got you into music? What was it for you that kind of introduced you to rock music?
Well, when I was lucky enough, my uncle Colin is my mum's younger brother. He was only about 10 or 12 years older than me. He'd been a bit of a teddy boy. I don't know if you know what a teddy boy is in the States. Like rock and roll, more drape coats and things. And then he wasn't going to be a teddy boy. He sort of became a bit more moddy. And he gave me his old 78 records when I was really little, when I was about 4 or 5, and we had a big old radiogram at home. And I used to put these records on, and the first records I physically put on myself were Chantilly Lace by the Big Papa, Great Balls of Fire by Jerry Lee Lewis, Teddy Bear, I remember, by Elvis Presley. I think there was something by Gene Vincent and Raunchy. But it wasn't the original version. It was by an English band called the Al Bostic Orchestra. Yeah, so that's what kind of got me going. And then very early 60s, all the kids had transistor radios. And I always think music's allied to the latest technology. You know, you wouldn't have had rock and roll if you didn't have tape echo for a start. You know, and then transistor radios come in, and that coincided with all the beat groups coming through. And there was no national radio station in England. There were pirate radio stations which were on boats just outside British territorial waters. There was a movie came out maybe about 10 years ago called The Boat That Rocked, which is about that. It's a bit of a comedy. But that's where all those bands came through. You know, there was the Kinks and the Yardbirds and the Who and the Early Stones and the Small Faces. That's what got me going. And then, not long after that, we had the best TV show ever called Ready, Steady, Go, where all those bands played. And Dusty Springfield was in it a lot, and she discovered Tamla Motown even before anybody in America had really heard about it, and brought over to America Smokey Robinson, Martha Reeves and the Vandellas, Richard Green, Sam Cooke, Otis Redding, who would play live on this show. And they had just lockdown, they had a Ready, Steady, Go special going back. And then episode, they had this Redding special, went out, and they was chatting to us behind the scenes, and two people, Eric Burden, and who was the bloke who did Out of Time? Chris Farlow. Chris Farlow said he was in a club, and he was singing, and in the front row there was that guy. He didn't know, he was staring at him all the way through the set, and he said, "Who's that?" You know, after the show. And the guy said, "Well, actually, he wants to come and speak to you." Come to speak to him. It was either it was Redding or Sam Cooke. He was doing a Ready, Steady, Go special. You're not too story. He said, "Well, you can see." And nobody had heard of Chris Farlow by that hardly. And there's this fantastic clip of the three of them doing, like, not a duet, a triet or whatever you call it, on Ready, Steady, Go. It was fantastic. That's what got me in.
As you were, getting a little bit older, and the early '70s were coming on, and I know there was a lot of unemployment, and a lot of people were kind of as miserable in London as they were in New York, and yet all of a sudden,
yeah. But hang on, you missed. There's a whole bit in between.
Sure.
Which I missed some of it because I got into football and girls and sort of drink and stuff like that. But then I started sort of checking out bands, progressive rock, which I liked some of it a little bit, but it was bands that came through. And one day I went down this place called Portobello Road, which is like the Melrose of London, or the East Village. Where are you calling from? You're up in Massachusetts, and
yeah.
Yeah, it's like the hip, trendy place. And I went in a record store, and in fact it was Rock On Records, which is the record store that, in the Rocker by Thin Lizzy. I get my records on the Rock On store, and there was a record in there, and it was in a grey cardboard sleeve with a hole in the middle, and it wasn't stuck together, it was stitched together, and it was exactly like the 78s that I had when I was a kid.
Right.
So I bought it. No idea who it was. It was the Faces' second album, Long Player.
Oh,
they
yeah.
deliberately made it look like a 78. Now, I like the Small Faces, but this band was called the Faces, and I had no idea who they were. This should be stay with me, and I loved it. And they do, maybe on Maze, and they do some Big Bill Greenleaf stuff, and I think there might be a Temptations song on there. I really got into it, and they kind of opened the door to me. I went to see them, and they were sort of mates with Bobby Womack and all that, and they used to do All Over Now, and then they wrote Stay With Me, and they stopped doing All Over Now for some reason. I wonder why. but there were bands like that, and to turn it full circle, that's I ended up playing with them, so that was great.
That had to be a real thrill for you, right?
Yeah,
to play with those guys.
Bad for them either.
Yeah. So let's go a little further up now. It's the '70s, and there's a lot of turmoil in London, and kids are bored and they're not working, but yet you find a job on Kings Row. Sounds like Kings Row was like this real center for kids who just looking to hang out. I mean, What was that like back before you started the band?
Well, it was kind of new to me. I started working there when I was 15 and a half, 16. It was only when I was at school. I got a job on Saturdays, and it was all a bit more grown up than I was at the time. But just by happenstance, I found myself in this place. I was looking for a job. I took too long being in this one particular shop, and I had to come up with something for some reason to hang out a bit more. And the guy said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "Yeah, do you need anybody to work here?" And he said, "Well, actually, I'm leaving in a couple of days. Why don't you call this guy?" And he gave me Malcolm McLaren's number. The next Saturday, I was working there. And it turned out to be Paul and John. But going back to meeting Steve and Paul, when I overheard they were looking for a bass player, and I was learning the bass, they said, I said, "Well, I play the bass." And they said, "What's your favourite band?" I said, "The Faces." And they said, "That's our favourite band too." So, it was all kind of, it was always in the thing somehow. But there was other stuff going on as well. And, the early 70s have been all good time rock and roll, which I liked and all that. And then it turned, there was a real political thing going on. Then there was a 3-day week. I mean, you had the IRA and everybody went on strike and there was power cuts and there was bombings in London. And there was a real air of despondency. And then we got John in the band, who was sort of Anglo-Irish, who had a real chip on his shoulder about lots of things. And he kind of put what we felt into words. It was just everybody in the right place at the right time. And then we was involved with Malcolm McLaren and Vivian Westwood and Jamie Reed, who did the artwork, and Bernard Rhodes, who went on to manage the Clash. Everybody having their own little bit, the whole thing worked. But it wouldn't have worked without everybody doing their particular part.
I have probably seen that video of you guys appearing on that Bill Grundy show
Right.
about 10 million times, because every time I see it, all I can
because
think of
you
is
like swearing.
well, no, the thing that's interesting about it is, you guys caught hell for that interview, but the fact of the matter is, Bill Grundy was kind of an asshole. I mean, he
was, yeah.
I mean, he completely provoked, whatever happened on that set. And it's interesting to me that, he didn't get the criticism for that interview.
Oh, no. He lost his job. And also, what you guys probably don't realise, he had been a really big world journalist, and he used to write for The Guardian. He was very well respected. And if, say, Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor came to England and were going to do one interview, they would do it with him. He was a big will. And he blew it. And he lost his job. And he picked on the wrong blokes. But it's basically because Steve Jones found a bottle of Blue Nun Riesling wine and drunk it all to himself, and it kicked in while we was on the
TV. As you're sitting there and this is happening, and I know Malcolm McLaren was beyond the cameras and freaking out, but as you're sitting there watching this happen, what was going on in your head during that interview?
I thought it was kind of funny. I didn't really realise at the time what Steve was saying. I couldn't hear. It was only because he was mic'd up that it was picked up. But, when he was over the far right, if you look at the camera to my left, well, I didn't quite hear what he said until the very end. It was like, I thought it was funny.
Yeah.
The thing was, it wasn't even the swearing so much. It was what time of day it was. It was live. It was just after the 6 o'clock news when everybody was sitting down and having their dinner, or whatever you call it.
Yeah.
But also, with what was going on in the country, I felt kind of used by the media. Them talking about the government's failures and people in flag and they were talking about us, and it was like we was a kind of a diverse. It's a bit like now Donald Trump going about this, that, and the other, and they suddenly, what's going on in the X Factor is the front page. It was a diversion. How you find it's not until you do things like that you find out how the world works.
Well, they certainly vilified you, and I know, even though EMI kind of arranged for you to do this interview, they dropped you as fast as the interview happened.
Yeah, but the record company didn't. The record company wanted to keep us. EMI, I only found out subsequently, but EMI isn't just a record company. They made guidance systems for nuclear missiles in England they'd invented the MRI scanner. They'd invented one. They had a prototype built, and they didn't have enough money within the company to put it into operation. They didn't know what to do, and they were like people from the Bible Belt turning up with attaché cases full of dollars who wanted to buy it, to buy the rights to it. The head of EMI had dinner with the Queen, and then all this happens. Something had to give. So the record company side of things were lent on. And that's why we went. Not because of the record company, it was by the whole conglomerate that was EMI.
As the United States started to report on some of the things that were going on, we got news stories that there was this band in England, and they were called the Sex Pistols, and they caused this huge furor on television. I'm only 11 years old at the time, and I remember watching this news story with my parents, and my parents just horrified and saying, what the hell is this? And I'm looking at this and going, yeah, that's cool. They just they just said a bunch of swears on television. At 11 years old, I feel like in a way that was an important thing for me to see back then, because in a way I realized that listening to the Eagles and Journey and even other bands that were around when I was a kid, that there was something else that was intriguing, and I really wanted to know more about that. And I think a lot of people felt the very same thing about the Sex Pistols and the Damned and the Clash, bands you kind of heard of, but you hadn't really quite heard yet.
For sure, but it worked. Then going back to the States, he told us about some of the bands that he'd been invited to see by the Ramones and the Heartbreakers, and Richard Hell was in them. And he told us about them. We saw pictures of them. But I said we'd heard about this sort of New York scene, and we'd seen pictures of like the Heartbreakers with Johnny Thunder's spin-off band from the Dolls that actually originally had Richard Hell in the band, a few other things. But none of them had made records at that stage.
Right.
So we had no idea what they sounded like. So when we first went to see the Ramones, when they came over, we were quite shocked. I think it was because everybody on both sides of the Atlantic got fed up with the same things that were going on and kind of went backwards to go forward. That's kind of, not always projected and songs about kind of hobgoblins and fairies and stairways to heaven and all that, but things that mattered to people a bit more.
Right.
Because we all felt divorced from it. Now, the only connection, and there's a really strong, the only musical connection, really, that is really tangible, has something to do with Massachusetts. And that's because there was a guy who wrote for the New Musical Express who was like the Lester Bangs of England. There's a guy called Nick Kent.
Okay.
And there were two shops. There was Malcolm's shop, which was like the punk shop, or became the punk shop, and there was another shop called Granny Takes a Trip, where like the Rolling Stones and the Faces and people like that got their clothes from. A dandy fashion, but all the stuff that went down there underneath the counter, if you can imagine what those guys might be up to. But Nick was mates with a guy called John Cowell. And John Cowell had been producing a band, and Nick Kent had a cassette tape of half this album, which hadn't been released yet. And he gave it to us, and we checked it out. And we did Roadrunner by Jonathan Richman and Modern Lovers, because it was we had half of Jonathan Richman's album maybe 6 months before it was released. And that was the only direct musical thing. And that's not really anything to do with New York, it's to do with Boston.
Yeah. And actually that was recorded. I thought, you talk about a band that was way ahead of its time. The Modern Lovers was certainly it.
Yeah, no, but great.
Yeah, it's a great record. The relationship between Malcolm McLaren and the band. I hear stories, all the time about what he did and did not do for the Sex Pistols, and it sounds to me like in many ways he was trying to create chaos from within the band. I don't know if it was like a creative decision on his part, but it sounded like that chaos was what fueled a lot of what the Sex Pistols did. Is that accurate or is that not accurate?
No, it's kind of accurate, but it's also what led to the demise of the band. You know, Malcolm McLaren was big friends with Bernard Rhodes, and he was involved with the Pistols right in the early days, especially when Malcolm was in the States, you know, doing the New York Dolls and that whole Red Patent level thing and all that. And I
Right.
was friends with Bernard Rhodes, and Bernard Rhodes helped Mick Jones form the Clash to prove to Malcolm that he was good, if not better than him. And Bernard took me aside one day, and I said, you know, he's talking about this, that, and the other. And I said, well, you're kind of lucky the Clash broke the States, you know, because they put out 4 or 5 albums. We only put out one. And Bernard said, well, we did, but we wasn't lucky. I made sure that happened. He said, I made sure that happened, that the band stuck together because I saw what happened with you and the Pistols, and I thought Malcolm was wrong.
I think in hindsight, the idea to let you go in that band.
Well, yeah, but hang on. Nobody let me go. I left. But I left because Malcolm made the atmosphere more trouble than it was worth. It seemed to a 19-year-old kid.
And yet the narrative of that was you hated the Beatles, you washed your feet too much. I mean, it sounded like the reality is not. Yeah, that's what it sounds like. That's what it sounds like. What's been your relationship with the guys in the band, you know, since that happened? I know you've played in reunion tours, but
well, we didn't speak for a long time. And then in 1995, I was in LA doing something that didn't quite work out, and I was sort of kind of knocking around a bit. And the guy I was staying with, he was Mickey Most's son, you know, Mickey Most, the record producer. He was living there. He put me up. He said, "Well, what are you going to do?" I said, "I don't know." I said, "You know what? I haven't spoken to Steve Jones." And he went, "Oh." Next day, he gave me a piece of paper with Steve's number on it. And he said, "Call him up." And I went, "Oh, I don't know. They said some pretty shitty things. Let me think about it." And this guy, Calvin, Mickey Most's son, every day for about a week, he said, "Call Steve, call Steve." And I didn't. And then I finally did after about a week. And Steve answered the phone. He said, "Oh, you're here. I heard you was in town. Come over." So I went to see him. As soon as I went to see him, Steve said, "Let's go and see John." So we went to see John, and when we got there, Steve said, "Let's call Paul." Paul was back in London. He was out. There was a time difference. And then we went out, and then Paul called while we was out having lunch. But it set a train in motion, you know, to reform the band. But it wouldn't have happened if I hadn't made that phone call, I don't think.
you know,
But I felt vindicated because they wanted to reform. They could have asked anybody else in the world to play bass, and they didn't. They asked me.
well, I think you know. I mean, I've interviewed Paul, I've interviewed John, and I think they both, you know, agree that you know that it was a mistake for them to lose you, and that you know it was the beginning of the end had already happened by that point.
Well, do you know what? It happened straight after the day after the Bill Grundy show. Steve says this. We became in such a goldfish bowl. I should be crazy. We didn't realise it at the time. And then we did that anarchy tour when we wasn't allowed to play anywhere, and it just got on top of us. Paul was in tears. It was a really weird thing for 19, 20-year-old guys to be involved in.
It sounds like you know that it was nothing but chaos from the outside. I mean, I'm sure there were times when you probably felt like you know we're doing the records are good, the songs are good. You know, you had to feel good about at least what was going on, but at the same time, there's this looming cloud over this band that has been created where it was almost designed to fall apart.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't designed, it's just what happened.
Yeah.
You know, I always saw, when we came together, you imagine like kind of, I don't know, imagine I've been there, there's a club called Knuckleheads in St. Louis I played at. And it's sort of out in the boondocks on the outskirts of town, right next to a railway sidings. You know, and there's all these tracks from across the country come at different angles to each other. And where they meet, you know, if all the trains were going at the same time as we were individually, you bump into each other and there's this big release of energy. And then the tracks keep going off in different directions. That's what happened to us.
You leave the band, you wind up doing a bunch of things. One of the things I think is really kind of an intriguing story is you wind up at some point, I think it's like 1978, you're in a band for a very brief time with Sid Vicious, the Vicious White Kid.
Oh, no. it was a one-off show for a laugh, and it was just to prove that we weren't total enemies. And we also kind of did it to probably annoy John and Malcolm as well.
And did it?
I don't know, but it was. I do know that Steve and Paul turned up at the gig, and Paul was on the side of the stage, and he wanted to play drums on a number, and I took great pleasure in telling him where to go. So, but the band was good. We had Rat Scabies and the band on drums.
Yep.
And he was actually not in the band at that period, and he had a band called the White Cats.
Right.
And Steve New, who played guitar, and me, we were in the Rich Kids, and that was the next thing that I did. And I formed the Rich Kids while I was still leaving the Pistols, and that helped me walk from the Pistols, because EMI said to me, "Look, we know you got a problem, and we hope you sort it out, but we see you as the main tunesmith in the band. And if it doesn't work out, we'd be more than interested in anything that you come up with." And I was 19 going on 20, and I thought, right, I'm not going to rush to sign to EMI, but this is when we were still signed to EMI. I thought, if they think that, every other record company will. And they did. And I did that, and that kind of helped me make my decision. Because sometimes things in life are more trouble than they're worth, which is what the Pistols seem like to me.
Yeah.
So anyway, when we did the Vicious White Kids thing, we needed a name. Sid Vicious, the Rich Kids, Rat Scabies, and the White Cats, the Vicious White Kids. It was just a laugh, But I tell you what, there was a guy in England called Rob Dickens, who was a good friend of mine, and he signed my Pistols publishing to Warner Chappell. And he was head of Warner Chappell, and he should have been head of Warner Brothers Worldwide, but it didn't quite work out for some reason. And there you go. But I approached him about some other project I was doing maybe 20 years ago now. He said, "Well, it's not bad, Glenn." He said, "But you know what the best thing you ever had was?" And I said, "Well, the Pistols." And he said, "No." I said, "What then?" He said, "The Vicious White Kids." I said, "We only did that one gig." He said, "I came to it." And he said, "You guys were so exciting." I said, "Well, why didn't you sign us?" He said, "Because you was all too out of it."
When you put it together and you think, Rat Scabies and Sid and you, I mean, it sounds like that had to be a hell of a night.
It was a hell of a night, and we only had about 8 songs, and we did the same songs 3 times. And the bootleg came out, which came from the end when everything had kicked in and didn't sound that great. But the first couple of sets were good. But the thing with that, it was all covers, and Sid was a great front man. He was a good singer and a rock and roll thing. But he didn't have what John had, which was like having the gift of the gab and being a fantastic lyricist.
Right.
John was like the Jonathan Swift of the punk days.
I always thought it was funny that when you look at his career, like, John has gone from being public enemy number 1 to all of a sudden a national treasure in just a matter of a decade. I just thought it was an amazing transition that guy has made over the years.
Well, maybe, but I don't know if you noticed, there was not riots, but there were some big punch-ups in London this week. There was all these guys from the north of England came down to protect the monuments of slavers and stuff like that from the Black Lives Matter kind of empathy group over here. You can read into that what you like.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about, and this is not Pistols related at all. It's about yes, I'm off of that now, Glenn. I promise. In 1980, you co-wrote a bunch of songs for an album that Iggy Pop recorded, Soldier, and
1979.
And I was reading some stories online about that experience, and it sounded like that was kind of a rough go too.
No, it was fun. It was great. And what was good about that was that the Rich Kids broke up. Right, I broke the band up because Midge and Rusty Egan did a side project with a guy called Steve Strange, which kind of took off. Yeah. And they invented neo-romanticism, which, good or bad, that's what happened. And they wanted to go in that direction, and I wanted to be a rock and roller. And, some things happened. They were doing bands, and I just said this ain't working out. And I was sitting at home, and I didn't know what I was going to do, and I thought to myself, wouldn't it be great if the phone rang? And I'm not kidding you, 2 minutes later, the phone rang. I answered the phone. Somebody said, "Is Glen Matlock there?" I said, "Is that?" He said, "Well, you wouldn't know me. My name's Peter Davis, but I manage Iggy Pop. Jim is sitting here with me. Can we would you like to meet for a drink? And I said, he's buying. They said, they are. I said, all right, I'll see you in half an hour. And we got on good. The next thing I'm on tour with Iggy Pop, and it was a tour to promote his New Values album, which they'd already made. The guy who played bass on the album was a guy called Jackie Clark, who used to play Vike and Tina Turner and somebody like that, was going to play second guitar on the tour, and they were short of a bass player. So they asked me to do it. So next thing, I'm on tour around Europe with Iggy and Scott Thurston, who ended up in the Heartbreakers, not Johnny Thunders and the Heartbreakers, the other Heartbreakers. Who's the other Heartbreakers? Tom Petty. Yeah, he's a pretty good player. Klaus Kruger, and there was another guy who played guitar. Well, Jackie Clark played guitar, and then later on he changed, and Ivan Crowd from the Patti Smith group played. Ivan sadly died 3 months ago. And I was a good friend with Ivan, but there you go. So I'm playing with people like that. But I'm also on tour in Europe, and I'd never done a proper tour in Europe, and he had roadies. You had a rider in the dressing room. You had leads at work. You had a proper sound guy. Pistols, we never had that. We just had some mates who didn't know what they were doing, and we're out with the rich kids. We didn't know that. I go to Berlin with Iggy Pop. We play a big show. Come on, let's go. Me and you, we're going out. So this place, after we played, and it's like, the movie Cabaret? Yep. It's like that. Right? And there's people swinging on trapezes, and these really good-looking women. I've had a drink and stuff. And then the club owner comes over, it's this gorgeous redhead, and we all go out all night long with each other. It took me till about 7 o'clock in the morning to realise that this gorgeous woman wasn't a woman, it was a bloke. And it was like Europe's most famous transsexual Robbie Hardy been having a scene with David Bowie. Yeah, it was quite an interesting time in my life.
Sounds like it.
Yeah.
So the new album could come out this fall. Hopefully it'll come out this fall. And again, if it's anything, you said it is different than a little bit more R&B like than the last record.
It's got a little bit more of a soul vibe to it, loosely. It's got some really good songs on it. It's got some great rockers on it. It's got something that sounds a bit like the Standells. It's got a KD Lane. It's got a 50s doo-wop song on it. It's all kind of honed by all fantastic guitar playing. I've got some other guest players in it. Neil X plays on a couple of tracks. He was in Ziggy Sputnik, he's a mate of mine. Chris Musto plays drums. Norman Watroy plays bass on a lot of it, from the Blockheads.
Yep.
And I've also got a guest appearance from this Japanese guy who's fantastic. He's like the Jeff Beck of Japan, called Hot Eye. He plays on the track. Wow. It's good stuff.
I can't wait to hear it. Like I said, I've heard a lot of your solo stuff before. I always thought it was great, and best of luck to it. I hope it comes out awesome. I'm sure it will.
Thank you very much.
So there you go. Not sure what Glenn was doing with his phone. I don't know if he was putting it in his mouth or what was going on there. Either way, I'd love to hear what you think. You can email me at bax@rock102.com and hope to have you back on Baxi's Musical Podcast.